Yeah, good stuff. Right, what we're going to talk about this evening is about performance in high pressure situations with particular relevance to pre-hospital trauma care, search and rescue, and trauma care in hospitals. And I want to divide the talk into three parts. I want to talk initially about how pressure affects our performance both positively and negatively. I want to talk a bit about the psychology and I suppose a bit of the neuroscience of why pressure affects our performance so much. And then I want to talk, I suppose the most in-depth part of the talk is about the owning the pressure model, what we can do to try and control the pressure to optimize our performance when we're looking after a critically injured patient. Now, we're all a bit like Liam Neeson in that we've all got a particular set of technical skills and factual knowledge. And when the pressure on us is optimal, our ability to use those skills to access that knowledge, to make decisions, to communicate, to work as a team, and to look after a patient the best that we can is absolutely at its best. But as we all know, when we're looking after critically injured people, the pressure can become uncontrolled and it can become excessive. And when that does happen, our ability to access that factual knowledge that we've got, to use those technical skills, to make decisions, take on board information, communicate, and work as a team starts to deteriorate. And that can lead to a reduction in our performance in actually looking after seriously injured patients. So my background, I work half-time in an emergency department in Glasgow, and then the other half of my time is spent with the Emergency Medical Retrieval Service in Scotland, providing pre-hospital trauma care and retrieval of patients with serious illnesses and injuries from remote locations in Scotland. I also spend a reasonable amount of my time working with different organisations providing opinions in fitness to practice proceedings, medical negligence proceedings, and with the Ombudsman in Scotland. And as part of that role, I get to look at cases that unfortunately have not gone well in many cases and analyse the decision-making processes and the carrying out of technical tasks. And very commonly, it is human factors that have led to errors and the way that people have reacted to high-pressure situations. And I became particularly involved or interested in performance in high-pressure situations about 5 years ago. The Retrieval Service in Scotland were given ethical approval to wear body cameras for us to film how we were performing when we were performing pre-hospital emergency anaesthetics. So the paramedic or nurse working with me would film and record me, and I would film and audio record them, and we would use that information for our debriefs. And what became obvious to me was that if the patient was getting better, if things were going in the direction that I wanted to, my ability to perform in these high pressure situations was pretty good. But when things were not going well, when the patient was deteriorating, they weren't responding to treatments, then I did not handle that pressure well at all, particularly in terms of my explicit communication, what I was saying to people, but very much my implicit communication about my tone of voice, my facial expression, my body language was really not good at all. And my name is Stephen Hearns, and it turned out that the nurses and the doctors that worked and paramedics that worked with me used to talk about a look that I could give them as being herniated when things were going wrong. So I realized that we as a team were working in high pressure situations. These were quite high stakes patients that we look after, and we needed to really think about what those pressures were and what we could put in place to manage those pressures to optimize performance. So I spent about 3 years researching my book on this topic, and I visited a number of high performance organizations that work in high pressure situations and looked at what pressures they face and what tools and techniques that they use to try and overcome those pressures. So to start off with, how does pressure affect performance? Now, the first thing to say is that mostly when people talk about pressure, it's with a negative connotation, as if pressure always compromises performance. That is not true. We all need a certain degree of pressure to optimize our performance. And that is what attracts us to the types of jobs that we have. We all want to be under pressure and to perform well in those different types of situations. That's what attracts us to looking after seriously injured patients. And for about 100 years, psychologists have considered this model for the relationship between pressure and performance, called the Yerkes-Dodson curve, which is the basis of my book. And what they talk about is the concept as pressure rises, we get low-level release of stress hormones, particularly adrenaline and cortisol, and low levels of adrenaline and cortisol act to motivate us, to arouse us, to stimulate us, to focus our attention. And as the pressure increases up to a certain point, we reach this sweet spot of optimal performance, which psychologists call flow. And that is when we are cognitively at our best. We are at our best in terms of getting information from our long-term memory, information from the scene around us, communicating well, performing practical tasks, and making the right decision. And that is a very pleasant place to be. And that's quite well recognized by artists, by authors, by musicians. And that is what this zone of high performance flow is, what attracts us to looking after seriously injured patients. But as we all know, pressure can become uncontrolled and we can get surges in pressure. And when that happens, we get surges in the release of those stress hormones, and that pushes into a zone which psychologists call frazzle. And when we move into that zone of frazzle, our cognitive performance deteriorates. At the extremes, we can move into the sort of rabbit in the headlight zone, which psychologists call freezing, when we get so much pressure that we actually instinctively play dead. We stop moving, we stop talking, and it's evolved from times when an animal trying to attack us or an assailant, and we think that we're potentially going to die, and we want to make out that we're not a threat to them anymore. So those people who probably recognize it in yourself, in extremely high pressure situations, can actually get into that freezing or choking phase. There's also a fourth phase of performance called disengagement, and that is when we haven't got enough pressure on us to motivate us, to arouse us, to stimulate us. So when we're in low pressure situations that are not motivating us, our cognitive performance is also suboptimal. So we've got these four levels of disengagement, high performance flow, excessive pressure frazzle, and freezing and choking. And I like to call this the arc of performance. And we've got our own terms for that zone of frazzle and even freezing in the emergency department in Glasgow. And we like to think about these different zones of pressure in terms of our ability to perform for a short period for an individual patient. But what we have to consider is that if we are facing uncontrolled pressure, say in a system where demand exceeds capacity on a regular basis, or a poorly designed service that we work for that constantly puts us into zones of excessive pressure, then chronic exposure to those higher levels of cortisol and adrenaline leads to physical illness, leads to immunosuppression and chronic stress, and indeed burnout. So it's not just about controlling the pressure to optimize our care for one patient, it's also important for our own personal well-being in the long term. So high performance is about achieving and maintaining that zone of high performance flow. And that's clearly about calibrating the pressure to achieve that zone of flow, and very much about avoiding excessive pressure and moving into that zone of lower performance frazzle. And I like to call this the concept of owning the pressure to achieve optimal performance. And one of the first things that we have to do when I'm running courses, doing consultancy work, is that I sit down with teams and actually say, what are the individual pressures that face you, both intrinsic pressures and extrinsic pressures? Because we need to have full awareness of what those individual pressures are in order for us to manage those pressures and achieve optimal performance. So why does pressure affect performance? The thing that we have to be realistic about is that we have not evolved sufficiently to deal with the pressures of modern life, in terms, especially ones involving large cognitive loads. So man's been on Earth for 200,000 years. And it's only in the past 50 or 100 years that we've started to ask ourselves to make complex decisions involving large amounts of information and carry out fine motor tasks and complex practical tasks. So for the first 199,900 years we've been on Earth, it's all been really pretty simple decisions about survival, food, and shelter. And the parts of our brain that we require to use for a high cognitive performance in a high pressure situation simply haven't evolved. And in particular, part of our short-term memory called our working memory, and that's where we take on board information from our senses, we consider different options for decision-making, is really, really small. And that is the main thing that limits our ability as humans to deal with complex, high-pressure, high-stakes situations. And as a result, we are really prone to cognitive overload. Too much information, too many decisions, too much tasks, too many stimuli, overwhelming our limited cognitive capacity. We also need to think about how we make decisions, and this is really critical for people that want to perform well in high pressure situations, both as individuals, as teams, and as organizations. We've got two ways of taking on board information and making decisions, and indeed carrying out practical tasks. We would all like to think when we're faced with a situation that we consciously and rationally take on board all of the information that's available to us, say for making a diagnosis. And we consciously and rationally consider all the options, and we consciously... Right, good stuff, man. I think the pressure got too much from my Wi-Fi connection there. Right, but actually the great majority of the time when we're making decisions, we're carrying out practical tasks, we don't use that slow, demanding analytical cognition. We use what's called automatic or intuitive cognition. And what happens there is completely subconsciously and really rapidly, in terms of milliseconds, the front part of our brain sees a situation, sees something that needs to be done, compares it to previous experiences and says, that's what the problem is, that needs and that's what needs to be done. And that's all done really rapidly and subconsciously. And that's a really good way to approach familiar, low risk, low stakes decisions and practical tasks. But it is prone to error if the situation is subtly different and we decide to make the wrong diagnosis or take the wrong course of action. The best way to describe this, I think, is learning to drive. So my kids are learning to drive, and at the start, they're having to use analytical cognition to think about whether their hands are on the steering wheel, looking down to see what gear they're in, thinking about what speed that they're doing, what other road users are doing it. And they're using analytical cognition for everything. So their cognitive capacity is completely jammed full, and they've got no spare capacity to have a conversation or to listen to the radio. But a year later, having repeatedly been driving, using those controls, it all becomes automatic. So they're not thinking about what gear they're in, they're not consciously thinking about what speed they're doing, and they've got spare capacity, say, to listen to a podcast or have a conversation with someone in the passenger seat. So they have converted tasks and decisions that require slow analytical cognition to ones that just require automatic cognition. So what they've done is they're looking at that limited cognitive capacity that was completely taken up by analytical cognition, decisions, and tasks, and converted them to rapid, low demand automatic cognition. And that's what we need to do to perform optimally in high pressure situations. And we'll come back to that. The other thing is we need to think about how we respond to high pressure situations. And again, this comes back to an involved survival type response. So when we're faced with a high pressure situation, say a failed intubation or a deteriorating patient, what we do is our brains really rapidly and subconsciously ask themselves 3 questions. How big and how complex is this problem? What resources have I got in terms of assistance, equipment, my own personal skills and knowledge to overcome it? And what is the potential outcome going to be? Is it going to make me look good? Is it going to be a positive outcome for the patient? Or is it going to be a catastrophe and I'm going to face some negative consequences? And once your brain has assessed those 3 questions, it's got 2 possible cognitive appraisals. One is a cognitive appraisal of challenge, i.e. this is difficult, but I've got the ability to manage this and I'm going to nail this situation and I'm going to look really good afterwards. And that puts us right into that zone of high performance flow. But we've also got the potential for a cognitive appraisal of threat, and loads of us experience this initial appraisal in a high pressure situation where subconsciously, without any time for any rational thought, this situation appears overwhelming. There's no way that I've got the ability in terms of time, help, own personal skills to overcome it. And it's going to be a catastrophe for the patient and for me. And that's known as a cognitive appraisal of threat. And that causes a surge in the stress hormones and puts us into that zone of frazzle or even to freezing. And we need to have different techniques to try and ride out that cognitive appraisal of threat to optimize our performance, especially in that short period after there's a surge in pressure. This is Neil Lennon, the ex-Celtic and Hibs manager, and he is at a press conference and he's just been asked a difficult question. And you can see that he has moved into that stress response. He's got a cognitive appraisal of threat. You can see that in all of his body language, his implicit communication. And especially when we're working in teams, so we cannot multitask. We like to think that we can do 2 things at once, that we can look at a monitor and hold a conversation with someone. We can be thinking about something whilst we're putting a cannula in. Our brains can't do 2 things simultaneously. What we actually do is that we do the 2 things in serial. We move rapidly from task 1 to task 2 and back to task 1 again. And our brains do that so quickly that we think that we're multitasking. But that's actually a really inefficient way to look after someone that's seriously injured, because what we're doing is we're having to refocus our brain and our attention from one task to the next and back again. So it's a really slow and inefficient way of working. And it's much better, if at all possible, to focus on one thing, get it finished, and then move on to a second one. So multitasking really limits our ability in high pressure situations. This is a wee bit complex, but just a couple of things to point out. In our long-term memory, we've got an episodic memory, which stores information from previous experiences, like things that we've maybe been taught in simulation or in courses, or when we've been looking after patients previously. And also semantic memory. Those are hard facts that we've memorized, say for an examination, or the hard facts about how to manage someone in cardiac arrest. And we've also got a thing called procedural memory in our long-term memory. And that is where we store information, particularly for tasks that we have repeatedly carried out, like riding a bike or driving a car, stuff that we've drilled. And psychologists have worked out that when we are under high levels of pressure, our ability to access the parts of our long-term memory that we've learned, say, or in simulation or with previous patients and hard facts, actually deteriorates. But the part of our long-term memory, our procedural memory, where we've repeatedly drilled something, improves. And that means that simulation definitely has its place. And it's also important to memorize facts so that we can call upon those in high pressure situations. But it means that we do need cognitive aids. We need to look things up when we're under pressure. And it also means that we should drill predictable tasks until we've developed automaticity for them, because in a high pressure situation, if we've repeatedly drilled something, our ability to undertake that task will be improved. We'll do it more safely and we'll do it more quickly. Another thing we need to think about, a limitation that we have, is our ability to communicate in high pressure situations. And we're really fighting with one hand behind our back in terms of our ability to communicate when we're under pressure. And we all know, particularly those of us that work in hospitals and the pre-hospital environments, that we have to work as part of flash teams with other organizations that we've never met before, that might have different objectives and they might have different language. This is a multi-professional flash team that I was involved in a few years ago with 60 different people from 8 different teams. And we need to have tools and techniques to optimize our ability to communicate and work collaboratively in those types of teams. So there are lots of things, because of our limited cognitive capacity, that limit our ability to perform in high pressure situations, particularly the size of our working memory, our ability to multitask, and our ability to communicate as part of a team in a high pressure situation. So how do we try and optimize the pressure, to own the pressure, to attain and maintain that zone of high performance flow? So from a book, I created this model, like an engineering system, about how we try and create an engineering system that maintains flow and maintains calibrated level of pressure. And that's divided into 4 sections: the pressure pump, pressure testing, training, pressure control, and pressure relief. So the first part of it is the pressure pump, and that's about leadership, selection, and culture of your organization. So what is your service, your hospital, your organization giving to you to allow you to deal with high pressure situations? I remember Gareth Davis, when I worked with London's Air Ambulance a long time ago, saying that in his experience, over 90% of high performance in a team was about selecting the right people with the right aptitude and the right attitudes. It wasn't about flash helicopters, flash equipment. It was about selecting the right people. And I would really advocate this book called The Attributes by a Special Forces officer who was responsible for selection in the United States, that looks at different attributes in people who are able to perform well in high pressure situations. And if we really want to get a high performance team, we need to select people on the basis of those attributes. And it was fascinating going to see how the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy and the Army select people to become fast jet pilots. And a big part of that is, if you want to have a high performance team and you want to be able to select people with the right attributes and the right attitudes for high performance, you need to have a lot of people applying for your roles to select out those truffles in amongst all of those applicants. You also need to think about the culture of your organization and how particularly it deals with being a learning organization, and it deals with things that maybe could have gone better. And especially thinking about learning organizations that try to identify marginal gains, a bit like the Sky cycling team, and trying to identify just small things that accumulatively add up to give a really tangible improvement in your performance as an individual and as a team. So constantly reflecting, constantly analysing performance, never sitting back in your laurels, and just making wee adjustments to continually improve what you do. And those small improvements aggregate into really quite substantial improvements in patient care. We also need to think about the leadership of our organisation. And this is a really good model that I like. It's called the iceberg model of the psychological contract. On the surface, it just looks like two sides. You put the hours in and you get paid, but there's so much below that in high performance organizations about all the different things that you can give to the people in your team and all the things that they will give you back. There's so much more than just financial rewards in a truly high performing team. The next thing we need to think about is pressure testing. How do we train our people for those high pressure situations? How do we go about inducting people and maintaining training once we've actually got them as part of the team? One thing I would say from the outset in terms of training is organizations really need to have clarity of competence. People need to know what they need to learn initially, what skills that they need to maintain. And that's really important in a high pressure situation, particularly for the leader, who you can safely delegate things to, because that's the best way that you can cognitively offload in a high pressure situation, is by safe delegation of decisions and tasks. Another thing is what I can now call the performance pizza model. And if you look at all of these four situations, they all look different. And you might think that you might need a different approach to all of those situations that's going to require just that demanding analytical cognition. But actually, if you look at any trauma patient or any pre-hospital scene, there are loads of things that you do every time you go there that are completely predictable and routine. For example, thinking about safety, performing a primary survey, packaging the patient, even an emergency anaesthetic. Although there are adaptations that are required, it's pretty predictable and routine. And there are also predictable emergencies, things that you can predict are going to go wrong, like a failed intubation, development of a tension pneumothorax with positive pressure ventilation, or sudden hypertension in a patient. And also, as we know, there's the unpredictable emergencies, things that we just can't see. We've got a really good slide with the MRS of one of our doctors and paramedics running down the road with the airway kit when they were anaesthetising someone in a country road, and I heard a flock of sheep was let out of a field running down the road. So any situation can, in terms of tasks and decisions, can be split into three types: predictable routine, predictable emergency, and unpredictable emergencies. And the key to all of this is to plan and predict, to plan and perfect everything that's predictable and try to convert that to that automatic, intuitive cognition, leaving your cognitive capacity for the demanding analytical cognition for the nuanced and unpredictable aspects of the job. So identifying everything that's predictable, planning and standardizing how your team's going to approach that, repeatedly drilling it until you perfect that. And absolutely, please identify things that you can drill. And that means maybe doing them 10 or 20 times until you develop that automaticity, freeing up your cognitive bandwidth for the demanding analytical cognition. And also, we put so much emphasis on simulation. There's so many things that you actually can improve your performance. Really good evidence from high performance sport simply by sitting in a dark, quiet room and mentally rehearsing different situations, particularly practical tasks, and particularly high stakes ones that you might do rarely, such as a perimortem cesarean section or a thoracotomy. And there's some guidance there on my website about how to go and do that. And when I run my courses, that is almost uniformly the main thing that people take away, that you can improve your performance without any equipment, without working with a team, just through visualization and mental rehearsal if you do it properly. And definitely we should simulate. but separate simulation from drilling. And really, when you're simulating, work in your human factors, work in your collaborative teamwork, your frontline leadership, and very much using your communication under pressure techniques. So that was a bit about training for high pressure situations. The next thing is when we're in those high pressure situations, what can we do to try and stop those surges in pressure pushing us into that zone of frazzle? And absolutely, we need cognitive aids, but not the types of documents that a lot of services and hospitals provide, 30, 40-page documents that are not designed to be read at 2 o'clock in the morning when we're tired and we're under pressure. What we want is simple documents that are bespoke to your team and to your level of experience and knowledge. We've got 100 of these in the Emergency Medical Retrieval Service in Scotland, and the way that we've designed them is that all of the information that you need to access when you're under pressure is on the front page, and we try and keep the operational part to 1 page, and then all the ask covering stuff, all the references, etc., are all on the back, and we keep them in an app as well, so they're always up to date, they're always accessible as well. And we need to have calculators as well for things like oxygen consumption during a transfer, drug doses, equipment sizes as well. All the time just trying to reduce the amount of cognitive capacity that's taken up by decision making. Also thinking about those predictable emergencies. Pilots have got dozens of what they call caption cards for predictable emergencies, like a battery failure, an engine failure, something overheating, and they've got pre-planned responses to those. And we should have those in medicine as well, rather than just thinking about with ventilators, etc., when something goes wrong. The Emergency Medical Retrieval Service, we serve 24 rural hospitals, take people to maybe 6 larger urban hospitals. And in our app, we've got direct dial phone numbers for all the wards. We know which of the rural hospitals have got x-rays, which have got blood, all that type of information accumulated and stored in the cold light of day, so that when we're in a high pressure situation, and especially when we're tired, is really accessible, just keeping that limited cognitive capacity free. And we're never more under pressure or at risk of that zone of frazzle or freezing in a multiple casualty major incident. So pre-planned responses to those incidents is absolutely essential in terms of action cards and checklists. Using checklists gives you so much more than just making sure that the equipment is there. There's quite a psychology around rituals and routines that help to calm you down before high pressure situations. So readiness states in terms of checking vehicles, checking equipment in the morning, pre-RSI, pre-sedation checklists, care bundles for sepsis, and even ready to go. Are we ready to leave scene here? Are we ready to leave this hospital with this patient with an air transfer? And also, many of you will probably be using these SCRAM airway bags and drug bags already. But the way that we store equipment, the way that we check it, the way that it's laid out, there's a whole science of ergonomics that goes into all of that, that really reduces pressure when we're undertaking high stakes interventions. And also personal protective equipment is important. Not just about keeping you safe, but feeling that you're safe and you're comfortable working in the pre-hospital environment, because that, if you don't feel comfortable, you don't feel safe, then that takes up part of your working memory and compromises your ability to make decisions. Also, we need to be aware of how fatigue affects our ability to take on board information, to make decisions, to communicate. And ideally have rotas that avoid that, but if you can't avoid it, having awareness of it as a team and having different strategies such as cross-checking, use of cognitive aids, napping, etc., to try and minimize the negative effects on cognitive performance that fatigue brings. So that was a bit about pressure control, things that our service and our team can supply us with so that we can manage those high pressure situations as well as possible and avoiding us moving into that zone of excessive pressure and frazzle. But just to finish off with, if we do end up in that zone of excessive pressure, in that zone of frazzle or even freezing, what tools and techniques can we use to regain personal composure and to regain situational control? First and foremost, really subtly, is controlled breathing. Slowing your breathing down to about 8 breaths a minute, 8 seconds per breath, will slow our heart rate down, slows down, reduces our sympathetic overdrive, and it will help to calm us down. And the good bit about this is you can do this yourself without anyone else knowing. So a really good technique, controlled breathing. Another one that's used by high performance athletes is positive self-talk or inner dialogue. Actually saying to yourself your own voice or a voice of a mentor that thought that you were a high performer, you've got this, you're going to nail this. And there's good evidence that that will improve your performance, it will improve your self-efficacy, and it will stop catastrophizing, especially when things are starting to go wrong. So positive self-talk or inner dialogue. A technique that I definitely use, and I think is actually personally the most useful for me, is cognitive reframing. And this is a technique used for people with anxiety. And what it's really about is getting yourself out of the situation and away from the stimuli and thinking about something completely different. So often in high pressure situations, I'll pretend that I need to go to the bathroom, or I'll pretend I've got to make a phone call. But what I want to do is I want to get myself away from all the visual cues, all the auditory cues, and just get myself into a neutral situation by myself. It's a bit like Control Alt Delete, and it doesn't have to be for a long period. And then the other thing that I always try and do, I was doing some work with some military colleagues last week, and we were really trying to encourage the teams to have what I call rally points. So when there's a lull in the tempo of things, is actually get together as a team and try and create a shared and an accurate mental of what is happening and create a list of what needs to be done and delegate that. We're all approaching things from different clinical backgrounds, different levels of experience. We come into situations at different times, and therefore we're all going to have different mental models. And we also want to try and overcome the effects of the expert halo and command gradient, where someone more senior will say, this is what's wrong, this is what we're going to do, and you think they're wrong, but you don't question it. And indeed, you end up thinking that you're wrong. So a rally point, if it's done effectively, gets everyone's opinion, everyone's observations on board, and then you break the problem down and you delegate it to cognitively offload. And if these are done really well, the leader shouldn't speak first, because as soon as the leader speaks first, then you create that command gradient and that expert halo effect. So a cognitive pause or a rally point, achieve a shared and an active mental model, list what needs to be done and prioritize that as well, because if a problem is broken down, you get much less of that cognitive appraisal of threat and you see it as being achievable. And as the leader, delegate to people that can make those decisions for you or carry out those practical tasks. And use cognitive aids when you are in that zone of frazzle. So control breathing, positive self-talk or inner dialogue, have a rally point, get that shared and accurate mental model, list and prioritize, delegate, get yourself outside to cognitively reframe, outsource, i.e. look things up, and for prolonged incidents, make sure that you're hydrated and you're getting enough carbohydrates and protein on board. So high performance is about attaining and maintaining that zone of high performance flow. And that is clearly about calibrating the right level of pressure and avoiding that zone of excessive pressure and flow and frazzle. So that's about the pressure pump, the organization. What does it do to create the right team, create the right culture and the right leadership? How do we train people? It's not just about simulation. Put a lot of emphasis on drilling and mental rehearsal, and think about how your long-term memory actually works. Give people the right cognitive aids and the right equipment, and put the right systems in place for checking that, and have those pressure relief valves to regain personal composure and to regain situational control. So that's me ready to answer some questions if there are any there.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Stephen. There's so much amazing insight that came out of there. Great learning points for everyone. And it's the simple things as well. Things that when you're under pressure, you do forget, just simple things like just breathe and take that time out, take those 10 seconds. And yes, there have been quite a few questions come through. So I'm going to do the usual, and I'm going to pop first just to tell everyone about our next webinar that's coming up. I hope everyone can see that and aren't looking at the questions instead, so do shout at me if that's the case. But we do have our next webinar coming up, which is actually just a week today. We've got Claire Baker and Mark Wilson coming to do our usual hot off the press webinar. It's been a while since we've had one of these. I think the last one was in October last year, and now just going to quickly check something. Oh yeah, perfect. So yeah, they're coming to talk to us about the relationship between traffic, collision dynamics and brain injury. So we're looking at sort of extrication and RTCs and how that can affect with traumatic brain injury. It's a paper that's been recently published. So Mark and Claire are going to be joining us next Wednesday at 8 o'clock to walk us through their paper, talk about the methods behind it, the research that they've done, and all sorts of wonderful things. So definitely scan the QR code that's on your screen now. There's only a few places left as well. So scan the QR code that's on your screen and join us next Wednesday for our hot off the press webinar, the return of it, so to speak. And of course, if you are not a member of Trauma Care, now is a chance to purchase your CPD certificate. So please do scan the QR code that's on your screen now, and you will be able to purchase the certificate. It's only £1.99. Proceeds all go back to the charity. But if you are just become a member, a few of you have signed up tonight, so thank you very much for that. If you have just become a member, do not scan the QR code that's on your screen now. You will get a free certificate sent to you, and it's not too late to join either. But if you don't fancy joining and have just joined us for the evening, do scan the QR code that's on your screen and you'll get a certificate. Now, Stephen, we have had quite a few questions come through tonight, and they're still coming in as well. So we'll try and get through these as quickly as possible. And if there's any that I do ask, as everyone knows who's joined us before, I'm not a trained healthcare professional at all. So if I have something that's irrelevant or has been answered during the talk and I've just missed it, I do apologise. But let's start from the beginning. So Moise, I do apologise for announcing your name wrong there, Moise, has just asked right at the beginning of it was, can you clarify explicit versus implicit comms?
Yeah, absolutely, as he moves his hands. So explicit communication are the words that you say. Implicit communication is how you say those words and what you emphasize, the volume of your voice, the tone of your voice, but also your facial expression, your posture, and what your hands are doing. And that is really important for lots of reasons. People just think it's about the words that you say, but it's about how you say them, and indeed what signals that you're giving out with your non-verbal communication. So implicit and explicit communication.
I love that. I love that. And it's not even something you really notice you're doing. And now you've said it, I've noticed my hands going. So yeah. Sue has asked, can people become slightly touched upon, but can people become so desensitized when under chronic pressure that they disengage? Or is that the same as freezing, which is ironic slightly?
No one's ever asked me that before. I would say that I don't know, but I doubt it. If people are in high levels of pressure, they're much more likely to stay in that zone of frazzle rather than to be disengaged. So I don't think so, but I've never been asked that question and I couldn't say for certain.
Fair enough, fair enough. So this was, Jessica, I think that this was kind of the calm down analogy that we got. So how do you build confidence in your management of the surge of stress? So I think that was kind of covered in those techniques that you gave us, but I don't know if you want to elaborate or have anything else that you'd like to add on to that.
Yeah, listen, I think just it's all about awareness, isn't it? That I think most employers should actually realise that's what causes burnout, causes chronic stress, is chronic exposure to those high levels of pressure. So I think most employers are aware of that. It's whether they do anything about it or whether they can do anything about it is a different matter.
Wonderful. And on the back of that, Rachel's asked, do you have any advice on combating the disengagement part of the performance arc? The majority all calls within the ambulance service seem to be over triage, so the pressure fluctuates so much a shift that it becomes common to be dismissive, then end up caught off guard when the patient is actually big sick.
Yeah, listen, I think that's a really valid and insightful point, and I really recognise that in myself. And the concept of cognitive biases really play into that as well. And I think we all recognise that we're quite primed when we're responding to pre-hospital incidents, dependent on the information that we get in advance, and also the types of jobs that we've gone to recently. And we're also affected by maybe older, more cynical people that we work with as well. And we sometimes can get to jobs that are actually a lot more serious and a lot more pressured than we've anticipated. And that takes quite a change in mindset. And that can certainly affect speed of response and definitely performances as well. So yeah, I couldn't agree more about that. Yep.
Perfect. And let's have it. So Samantha's asked, can you give details for applying to a retrieval course, please? So any details for a retrieval course that you might have up your sleeve?
I don't. I run performance under pressure courses and mountain rescue ones. I don't run any retrieval ones, I'm afraid. No, sorry.
I think what I will say for that, Samantha, if you check out ATAC, I think they sometimes do retrieval courses, and World Extreme Medicine might be running a few as well. I know the Medical Lodge as well have a few courses available, so check out those three. They might have something coming up as well. I know for a fact Medics Lodge definitely has something coming up fairly soon, but whether it's retrieval based or not, don't quote me on that. James, I just saw you put in the chat as well that you've had a bit of trouble getting onto the website. So I've said it a few times, but and it's kind of been all over our Twitter as well, but obviously things get lost in algorithms, or you might not join on time. Our website is currently undergoing the back end of it, so it looks like we're just not doing anything. We're just leaving it to sit in the ethereal region and on the Fey plane, so to speak. But what's actually happening is we're doing a lot of back end work at the moment on the domain, and the domain's kind of been caught up by the registration company as we're doing this back end work, so we're not able to point it anywhere, so to speak, at this moment in time. It's no one's fault. It's just been caught up as we're doing a load of work. We're also doing work on our CRM system to get things more streamlined and notifications go out more often, and as a result we've had to take a website down whilst we do all this back end work. But we have got the temporary domain up and running. If you go onto our Twitter feed, I think it's a couple of tweets down, you can click onto our temporary website through that link instead. So back to the important part, which is asking questions. So anonymous attendees asked, when working with inexperienced or trainee staff, how do we encourage them to work towards frazzle to allow them to recognize when they have reached flow?
So I would say that's quite a dangerous thing to do. There are lots of people that simulate to frazzle because it's quite good fun for the people that are running the simulation. I really quite disagree with that, and it can look really flashing in social media, etc. So there's two or three reasons for that. One, what you're really wanting to do is simulate to the zone of flow. So you want to simulate people to the stage where they're under the right amount of pressure, that they are performing optimally. Because at that point, you're going to lay down the best long-term memories, you're going to learn from it, and there's a thing called your conditioning memory, and they're going to associate a real job, which is similar to the simulation, positively if they have performed well. People who simulate to frazzle will make people feel really uncomfortable. They will perform badly. They won't lay down long-term memories as part of your brain protects you from PTSD by stopping you laying down long-term memories when you're stressed, and your conditioning memory, when they're actually faced with a problem like that, will associate it with negativity and poor performance. And people that do that, simulate to frazzle, generally don't know how to give people the tools to regain personal composure and situational control. I obviously feel quite strongly about this, but people, train hard, fight easy, and stress inoculation, absolutely, but you really need to know what you're doing. You need to deliberately let people know you're going to simulate them to the zone of frazzle, and you need to stop it at the right time, and also give people the right, really, really good feedback and the tools to manage it. And then you need to put them into that zone of frazzle again and let them use the tools. So people that just set up crazy simulations that put people into the zone of frazzle are not doing anyone any favors.
No, I completely agree. Completely agree. That's a wonderful advice to across sort of any any industry really. So Roger's asked, how do you handle conflict within teams, e.g. differences in clinical decision making or management, etc.?
Listen, not with management, I don't know about that, but yeah, I've got a thing in my course about conflict management, and there's different strategies to manage that depending on how urgent the situation is. A lot of it's about trying to understand the reasons why someone would be disagreeing with you, wanting to take a course of action, and trying to address those issues. So it's quite a complex answer to that, because there's half a dozen reasons that people behave like that, and also a lot of the time you could be wrong yourself and they're right. So yeah, it's something I teach on my course, but it's not something I could give a short answer to at the moment.
No, perfect. Thank you very much. And I think we've got time for just one last question, because the time is running on and the questions keep on flowing in. So what I'm going to do, with Steve's permission, is I'm going to download all these questions and I'm going to send them across, and we'll try and get emails back to you guys with answers to your questions, because there's so many going in, and for every question that's asked, another one, every question that's answered, sorry, another one is asked, because it's such a hot topic. So for the last question of the night, and it was one that I spotted that I quite like, but it might, again, apologies if it's completely irrelevant here. It's from Matthew Turner, do you encourage the use of break words? If, for example, I'm at full capacity, or my bandwidth is full, I've run out of spoons, or my health bar's empty, however you want to put it, within established teams, when you reach the self-recognized frazzle threshold, how can this be adopted for flash teams, which is the part I thought was quite interesting?
That's a great question, and absolutely, definitely, people need to be honest to their teammates and to say that so that the other people in the team can sort of cognitively offload them. They can get a wee bit of a timeout for cognitive reframing. But as Matthew says, doing that in a flash team, so that's also what's called showing vulnerability as well, i.e. I'm not all over this and I need some help, which is really good within a team that respects you and knows your abilities. But if you do that in a flash team, then it could be perceived as incompetence. And what might happen is that people might think that there's a bit of a leadership vacuum and try and fill that vacuum. So in your own team, absolutely, it's really powerful. But doing it in a flash team of individuals who are under pressure could be quite counterproductive. But definitely amongst your own team, put your hands up to it and cognitively offload and try and get out of that situation.
I love that. Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you so much. And thank you all as well for the great questions. As said, we've just had too many to answer tonight. I think we got up to about 22 questions in the end. And unfortunately, we would be sat here till 11 o'clock tonight if we had the time to answer them all. So what I will do is I'll download these questions. I'll get them sent out to Stephen. And if he graciously has the time, hopefully we might get some answers back. But please don't be offended if we don't get back to either. Obviously, there is a lot of pressure on a lot of people at this moment in time, so to speak, excuse the pun. Okay, cool. So as always, the last thing that we need to do tonight is just thank our sponsors, our wonderful sponsors, who without we wouldn't be able to bring webinars to, we won't be able to bring the conferences that we do. If you were there at the conference this weekend, you probably spotted some of these guys, Simon walking around giving out pens to anyone who would listen. So the first sponsor is Galen, who manufacture Penthrox, the first line emergency analgesic. If you were there this weekend, you saw it flashed about everywhere. It's a superior pain relief. You've probably seen it on TV. You probably use it yourself. It's everywhere at the moment, but it's a fantastic thing to learn about. Penthrox University also exists, and they have CPD accredited webinars, which is 1 hour's worth of points. You can scan the QR code that's on your screen right now to get to their wonderful webinars. They have so many resources available, and it's so valuable. And this is the T's and C's if anyone needs it, the administrative instructions. And we are also sponsored by Icarus, the power of health. Scan the QR code that's on your screen now to find out more about Icarus and all the wonderful they do around the world. They're incredibly busy at the moment. And if you scan the QR code that's on your screen right now, you will find out why. And of course, World Extreme Medicine, another sponsor of ours. We are so proud to be with these guys. If you scan the QR code that's on your screen now, you can go and find out, as I said earlier, about their retrieval courses that they have going on. They've got wilderness courses. They deal with the more extreme sort of austere environment side of trauma. They've got plenty of courses available, loads of cool merchandise as well, and the conference coming up themselves in, I think Nick told me, October. So scan the QR code that's on your screen right now, find out more about their conference and the great work that these guys do all over the world, and especially at this moment in time in Turkey and Syria. And partnered proudly, our academic partner is the University of Wolverhampton. Scan the QR code that's on your screen now. It will take you through to ACAS. So if you have a child or a friend or anyone who wants to become a paramedic and is around this area or fancies moving away, this is a great course to check out. I've been to their campus. It's absolutely amazing. So do scan the QR code that's on your screen now. Get applying to a position, to a place on the paramedic science course. Wonderful university, and we are very proud to be partnered with them. So that's all there is to say from me this evening. So Stephen, thank you so much. I don't think I've ever seen the chat quite so active and going, and everyone has reiterated, someone just said it was an exceptional webinar, and I couldn't agree more. The questions are still coming in, as I see in front of me as well. So thank you very much. You've definitely given everyone a lot of food for thought, a lot of pointers to go away with, and hopefully people will be more prepared to deal with pressure in their everyday lives, whether it's within work or outside of work as well. So that is all there is to say from myself. So thank you again, Stephen. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Hopefully see you at next week's webinar, or if not, at Manchester, or the webinar the week after. We've got plenty going up. Do check out our Twitter page to get onto our new website, and you can find everything out on there. So that's enough for me. Good night, all. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Be kind to yourselves and have a good week. Bye-bye.